Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. Today, Jennifer and I are joined by Indi Gage, and she is a podcaster who has the podcast Hot Girls Theory podcast. It fits within the category of society and culture, and the main themes include sex, dating, relationships, intersectional feminism, spirituality, and more. And trust me, and more includes a lot. It's a really awesome podcast. Y'all need to take a listen to it. It's Indi and her co-host, Ash. So really, really awesome podcast. But also, Indi is 25 years old, living in Melbourne, and a soon-to-be graduate of LaTrobe University with a BA majoring in gender, sexuality, and diversity studies and a minor in sociology. So awesome. Indi, you are a very busy woman. Thank you so much for being on our podcast.
That's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here, and thank you so much for the lovely introduction.
So I think today we'll just start with you kind of introducing yourself and telling us your story.
Sure. Yeah. As I said before we started recording, like, oh, that's a loaded question. Like, it's not really a question. It's more of a just like an open-ended kind of let us know. But I guess story-wise, like for me, I guess I just have to preface, like, there's many different kinds of stories I could go through with like what my story is. But I guess if we're going to take it back to like some childhood stuff, like I grew up in Australia. I'm from Adelaide originally, so I moved to Melbourne about 2 years ago, but I grew up in a very kind of dysfunctional family. I'm an only child, but I also don't have any close in age cousins. So I was really like a kid with all the adults, like, you know, living my life that way. So I feel like I often related to older people as I was really young. And both of my parents were also drug users throughout my childhood as well. And so for me, there was like a lot of like tumultuous, you know, events happening. But my parents were also very, very loving, very, very caring, also very, very trusting. So like it was, you know, I never want to give people the perception that I had a lot of childhood trauma that was like, you know, directly caused because I had abusive parents. I never had that situation. It was just my parents were drug addicts, and that was a fact about them that I had to deal with and caused me trauma. But, you know, it could have been a lot worse sometimes. And then from like growing up from there, you know, as an only child, and also I've always been like a big girl as well. So it, you know, growing up, it's never easy. It's never easy to kind of go through life as a big girl sometimes. And so when I was 15, my dad passed away, and he actually overdosed on heroin. And so for me, that was like a really pivotal moment in my life. You know, obviously, again, that's like a perfect example of like, you can have a really loving parent and it can be a really contentious relationship because, you know, they're also like a toxic person on some level, and they can't help it. So I spent a lot of time in my teenage years like kind of going through the motions of like grief and trying to understand myself and trying to grow as a person, and also trying to detach myself from my family who were responding to my dad's death very, very differently, and trying to kind of control how I felt in the situation and force their idea of how I should be grieving my drug addict dad versus like, you know, for example, my grandma, who was very much like, I lost my son, and she was trying to compartmentalize the drug abuse and make her way through it. And I don't blame her for that, but, you know, it was a lot more pressure on me at that time. And yeah, so when I was in school at that time, I really was trying to just focus on I was like fully in survival mode, you know, trying to focus on how I make it through, how do I, you know, survive my life after I kind of experienced like one of the worst losses someone can experience. And even though I had that relationship with my dad where I was like, I really loved him, at the same time, I knew very early on that it was kind of like the right thing to happen. You know what I mean? Like it was not, for me, it was a moment, an opportunity to grow. And I think I needed that kind of separation from him just at that point in time where our lives were. And so I kind of I got through high school and like jumbled through it. And then I really wasn't doing much with my life per se, like I am now. Like I was just kind of working full time. I didn't really have any interest in going to uni. I was very much under the impression that I was not uni smart and that I was, because my grandparents were always like, if you're not good at maths, then you're not smart, that kind of mentality. So for me, it was very much like, okay, I've just got to work and I've just kind of got to be a wage slave and I've just got to do it like this. And I've just got to go paycheck to paycheck. And I've living my life the way that my parents kind of lived their life, just minus all the drugs. And, that idea of kind of being born into poverty and not being able to, kind of figure it out from there. And I always had an interest in women's studies and media studies and things like that. Throughout, like when I was in year 11 and 12, that was what I did. I did gender studies, I did media studies, and I did English in high school. And because by the time, so we had those classes in my high school. Yeah, by the time I could kind of drop maths and drop science and all of those subjects that made my brain just like explode, I was like, okay, I'm ready to do things that like I enjoy and I like. And it helped me because by the time I was in year 12, after my dad had passed away, I was like ready to get back into school and actually finish and do well. And, I guess standard I did. And that was, encouraging because I think it was the first time that I'd been so far detached from my family that I could feel smart and I could feel comfortable within the way I am intelligent. And so after about a year of doing full-time work, I was unhappy. I was, not in a good space. I was also in a toxic relationship at the time too. And I was like, okay, I need something for myself. I'm going to go to uni. And so I started at a different uni than what I'm at now. So it was a women's studies degree or major back then. And it's all the same content. It's really nothing different. It's just under a different name. And I've been making my way through it slowly but surely because, there are life things and you can't always do full-time study. So I started it and really kind of discovered that I am actually academic and I have the capability to be smart in my own way. And then, from there I was like, okay, I'm a bit of a like workaholic, but not in a like I try not to be toxic about it. So I've just consistently kind of been like, hey, what can I work on when I'm not doing uni stuff? And so after I moved to Melbourne and the pandemic hit, it was really like, all right, well, what else can I do to kind of get my voice out there and talk about the things that I want to talk about? Because I love having these kinds of conversations where we get into gritty topics. And, if you like this podcast, I'm sure you'll like some of the topics we tackle on Hot Girls Theory. It really is about connecting with people. And my co-host and I were kind of on the same page about that from the start. So we were like, fuck it, let's start a podcast. I hope I can swear. I really
Oh God,
I'm
absolutely.
okay, good. I am kind of I am like anytime I go on, especially like an American podcast, I'm like, are you gonna make the Australian censor herself? Like I promise you I can't do that.
No.
That's good. But so Hot Girls Theory was born, like most podcasts around then in the pandemic, and it's grown and we've been going for the past 2 and a bit years, and it's really helped me, I guess, figure things out, because I also, through this process of like, coming to a podcast and self-reflecting week in, week out, like it's a lot of work and it's a lot of self-work, which is great. I've come to the realization that like I'm neurodivergent and I have ADHD and autism, and that is also a part of the reason why my intelligence was not questioned, but like it wasn't seen as the norm by my family, and why I had a lot of deficiencies growing up in my ability to communicate or articulate myself. And I mean, I could say other things about myself, but I guess that's kind of like the outline, the basics of my story and where I've come from. And I'm sure more will come out as we chat.
Awesome. Okay, I have to say, Indi, that from hearing you say this today and then going through your podcast and reading your information, you and Ash's story, like sounds so similar to mine and Jennifer's as far as the podcast goes.
Interesting.
Because it very similar story. And,
yeah,
we've known each other since high school and started the podcast during the pandemic, sort of the similar thing of having the hard conversations and a lot of self-reflection and all of that. One thing that I notice about you throughout all of this is your ability to self-analyze and come to your own conclusions about yourself and sort of build on that and build your self-confidence, right? And I see that with the podcasts that you do and your body positivity and your going to university and finding something that works for you. Can you talk a little bit about your how you do that? I mean, because it can be so difficult to come to those places of being confident in yourself and figuring out who you truly are, but to do it at such a young age, I think is admirable. So
I think it's interesting when people ask me that, because usually people ask me that in the context of like they see it in me and want to know how they can have it for themselves in a like not like a I'm jealous of you way, but in a like just help me way. And sometimes I have to kind of preface to my friends, if we're having that kind of conversation, like I can take you to the water, but I can't make you drink it. Like, you know what I mean? Like there is a certain level of like just understanding yourself that you need that I don't think a lot of people are really prepared to understand, like that people aren't prepared to look inside and reflect on their own actions and behaviors and go, okay, how can I learn from that situation and come out of it a better person? And for me, I've like literally since childhood always been a very self-assured person. And I think it's because there is a context of like I had to live a lot of my life in fight or flight mode, and I had to make a lot of really hard decisions, and I had to be a parent to my parents, which meant I was an adult from a really early age, and I was perceived as an adult from a really early age. Being tall, being fat, I was like, that whole idea of like being older was always pushed on me. So I think when you're forced into that as a child, you really don't have any other choice but to like be very in tune with not only other people's needs, because of either you need to be there for them and show up for them because they can't care for themselves, or for example, I had a grandmother who was narcissistic and she made her feelings more important than everyone else's. So you're kind of constantly, and I think I'm naturally intuitive as well, so there's also an aspect of that. So it means I'm not only in tune with what everyone else's needs are, it makes me more in tune with what my own needs are. Because I had this journey of like, I used to apologize all the time as a kid. I used to be that girl who would be like, oh, I'm sorry. I used to have really bad issues with anxiety. And so the more I started to shift my focus away from what other people needed in my life and towards what I needed in my life, I was then able to figure it out. Like it's hard because it sounds so easy, but it's really like it is a process. And there's definitely been times when I was younger where it was a lot easier for me to be confident in certain areas and harder to be harder to put those boundaries up. You know what I mean? Like I could be confident alone, but I would still be working on how do I voice that to people and how do I articulate that to people. And so for me, a big thing is boundaries, having personal boundaries with not only yourself, but with others, and actually setting those boundaries and following through with those boundaries is going to be a really, really, really imperative way that people can find their own voice and find power within that voice, and then also confidence within that voice. So it's kind of like a connect, like it's a chain link, right? Like one after the other, it will come to you. And also it's important to remember that it's not linear. So if you have times where you're feeling really confident and then you come back down, or like, for me, when I was in that toxic relationship that I mentioned when I was in my really, really early 20s, because I'm still in my early 20s, technically, I had friends after that relationship ended kind of say, well, how, like, and I know they didn't mean it in a negative way, but, they said that whole, like, I couldn't imagine you ending up in a relationship like that. And for me, it was like hard because I was like, yeah, but I wasn't that person at the start of the relationship. And through a process of, being gaslit and manipulated and abused emotionally, I ended up being a person who was in that kind of relationship. And that's not my fault. And you know what I mean? So there is a level of processing it takes to come to the conclusion of like, I am a confident person, and that's genuine. My confidence is coming from myself. And until that point, it's kind of fake it till you make it, and working through the motions, which isn't easy for everyone. And I understand that.
No, it's incredible journey and transformation. I heard you say the podcasts feel like therapy to you. Did you also do any kind of outside therapy?
Oh yeah. So for the podcast specifically, it was always kind of the intention that at least the first like 6 months of the podcast was heavily focused on Ash and I telling our story, because okay, yeah, it's a public platform and people are going to be able to listen to it who know us, but also at the same time, like, we have significant stories. Like Ash has, a situation that's probably a lot more relatable than mine. And then my story is going to touch on people who have had issues with, drug abuse in their life, or it's going to open people's minds if they've never experienced that, because I can articulate my story and my perspective in a very specific way, and so can Ash. And so we wanted to have that platform to be like, okay, this is our trauma, being very candid about it. Here is how we learned from that, and here is how we still need to learn from that, but we're working on it. So week in, week out, you're thinking about your own behavior. We also had a whole episode each where we talked about all of our past relationships and how we learned and grew from all of those relationships. So it's very much like, okay, therapizing ourselves. But when my dad first died, yes, I did see a psychologist, like, for the grief, I guess, within the like a very early stages of that grief. And it was like, okay, because I think I was just trying to talk my way through like what was important to me, because no one else was listening to me about what was important to me about my relationship with my dad. And then I was okay for a while and made it through school. And then I was probably about midway through that toxic relationship. And that toxic relationship was a kind where I was like, oh, I want to see a psychologist, or I want to, get help for something. And he was very much like, no, you can't do that, because if you get help, then you'll want to leave me. It was very much like, if you go to the gym, you'll get hot, and other people will find you attractive, and
you are hot.
yeah. Well, this is the thing is, thank you. This is the thing though, is like, that was his mentality of like, if I work on myself in any way, other people will find me attractive. And he was just very insecure and had a lot of issues when it came to things like cheating and infidelity, and was very like controlling.
Well, yeah, and you would have figured out that he was, trash, and you would have left. So, which you did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing, is what you like, you don't know what you've got until it's gone, kind of thing. But it's the same thing with bad relationships, is like, you don't realize how bad it is until it's gone, until it's purged from you. So for me, therapy, when I started back up again, it was really good, because I didn't have to do a lot of searching for my therapist. We just clicked right away, and I was able to be like, hey, I have all of this trauma. What do I do with it? I think because at that point in time as well, I was kind of going through like a second wave of my grief, where I was like really grieving the life that I was living, that my dad wouldn't be able to see as someone. Like, I think at that point it had been maybe like 5 or 6 years since my dad had passed away, because it's 10 years this year, because I was 15. I was talking about how I had that relationship with my family that was breaking down, and she helped me kind of articulate my feelings and write a letter to my family, and process all of the stuff that I needed to say in a way that was like not going to be inflammatory. And it was really, really helpful. But I haven't been back to therapy since, just because, it's expensive. And I think it's also, when I moved to Melbourne from Adelaide, it was really cathartic. When people ask me why I left Adelaide, I always say a blanket statement of like, oh, it's the trauma. But for a better analogy, is like, it's like growing up in a house where a lot of bad things happen to you. You don't want to live in that house anymore. And so when I left Adelaide, it was very much like a sense of relief, because I was no longer being triggered all the time when I was driving to and from my place of work, for example. You know what I mean? Like, there's memories everywhere. I would drive past my high school. I'd drive past old houses, and I'd go to the city and be like, I don't want to see this person. I don't want, and for those who need context, like my old city is very much like big country town vibes. Like everyone knows everyone. Yeah. It's really, really small. That's why not a lot of people outside of Australia know about it, because they're just like, oh, I just know Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane,
It's interesting that you say that maybe your partner's story is more relatable and yours is less relatable, because I relate so much to you. Like so much. Yeah. I have a sister who died when she had 2 small children. We now know she was one of the first in the opioid addictions. We didn't know what opioids were then. And my sister was loving. She loved her children. And there was a lot of, maybe not outward abuse, but definitely some neglect and stuff like that.
Oh, and,
yeah. And those waves of grief, they come and go, and they change and they evolve, and they're never completely gone, I don't think. And my sister died 20 years ago. And then the other thing is, it's funny to me that you call yourself a fat person, because I totally relate to being a fat person. And I look at you and I see a very normal person. I don't see a fat person at all.
That's totally valid. I think for me, like just touching on your sister, like I think it's, really wonderful that you talk about her and that you can reflect on her. And I think it's very important that you keep talking about her, and because at the end of the day, like drugs are still a huge fucking problem in our society.
Oh my God.
And the more we talk about how it affects us on an individual level, the more we can kind of change the story and the narrative. Because I think when I talk about my dad, a lot of the time people hear, oh, drug addict, you must have had a really, really horrible childhood. He must have been really abusive and neglectful. And I would say, no, I love my dad. I'm glad he's dead, but that doesn't take away from the fact that like I love my dad and he gave me a very good childhood as best he could. You know what I mean? Like it's always hard.
I do know what you
people
mean.
Don't understand. When people don't understand. But like with my body in particular, like I don't have what you like. I'm a size 18 to 20. Like I'm 6 foot. I'm a big bitch. Like I am big, but I will admit, like I am what you would call like on the smaller end of fat or plus size, or however you articulate it. And I think the thing is all of Australia has like a perspective of like what the ideal beauty standard is. And I would assume it's something similar to like the Californian beauty standard, because it's very like beachy, skinny, bikini bod, blonde. No one in Australia, I mean, people do look like that in Australia, but no, not the majority. And I think the issue is like, I grew up in the early 2000s when heroin chic was what was in. Like, I saw the tabloids and I saw all of the fat shamey, body shamey, like, calling Kate Winslet fat. Kate Moss was idolized, like all of those things that kind of really shape you as a person. And, I've always been, I wouldn't say always bullied, but I've definitely always had people point to my weight, especially family members and people like in my peer group, as an issue for them. And so for me, identifying with the word fat is in part reclamatory for like that time in my life. And second of all, like I've been bigger, and I current, like I think in the past like year or so I've put on a bit of weight and have been like I guess internally dealing with that, because we're all affected by it, even if we try and I try and be body neutral, because I think it's easier to be body neutral than be body positive, because it's like consistently trying to battle with that. And so for me, like my relationship with my body is also the fact that I don't have like an ideal beauty standard body. Like my body type is very apple shaped, and I don't have hips, and I don't really have a booty. So like it's kind of this thing where like my relationship with my body is forged by like my past experiences, but also how I feel most comfortable representing myself, because I can't go into the shops and find clothes that fit me here, but I have other privileges as a smaller fat person, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like it's totally, I can see why you'd look at me and wouldn't be like, oh, that's a fat person. But also online, I can make myself appear smaller, if that makes sense as well.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes, 100%. We know what you mean.
Yes, we totally do. We totally do. Jennifer and I've talked about our weight struggles and body image issues many, many times on the show. My issue, or one of, because there's a plethora, but one of mine is is the whole body dysmorphia thing, because I used to be a lot smaller than I am now. And back in that day, I thought I was the size of a barn. I mean, literally, like I thought I was enormous. And I look back at pictures and I'm like, I was freaking skinny. Like, you know, objectively, I was thin. And then menopause hits and I've gained.
She doesn't know about menopause.
Yeah, I know you don't know about menopause, honey, but you'll
I have
get there.
a 50-year-old mother, thank you very much.
Oh God, we're the age of her mother. Oh God.
That's great.
Woo. I don't it's fine.
Mama
it's
knows
fine.
what we're talking about. Anywho, so going through the whole menopausal weight gain bullshit.
It's real.
So it's real and it's awful and it's so I'm really glad that you bring up the point about body neutrality as opposed to body positivity, because I have a hard enough time with body neutrality. I can't get to body positivity right now.
Well, here's the funny thing about Raquel is she was telling me on all these podcasts how much weight she's gained. And then I got to go see her this summer. She walks down this flight of stairs and I'm like, no, you look great. Like you're out of your mind.
Yes, the body dysmorphia is real.
It is.
It's relatable. I mean, like in the past, I would say about it, you know, I've put on weight. I couldn't tell you how much. I just know like my body's changed and I have definitely not been exercising and eating the way that I used to. So it happens with that particular, I guess, quote unquote lifestyle, even though I don't really like that term. And I definitely look back at photos, even just from a year ago, and like think about how I saw my body and how I perceived my body and go, what the fuck? Because even though it's like it's probably like, I know you guys don't use kilos, but maybe 5 to 10 kilos. I have no idea what that is in pounds, but I think maybe like roughly double, like something like 20, you know, something like that, 15 to 20 pounds. I really don't know the conversion, but like, you know, it's not even a significant amount of weight that I put on, but it is enough for me to notice the difference in my body. But it's harder for other people to notice that difference in my body because one, they're not looking at their body all the time, and two, my body, sorry, all the time, and two, I also already am bigger, so like it is, I guess, more significant to notice like when a smaller person gets bigger. And I think for me, I really focus on body neutrality, and I'm even with me gaining weight recently and kind of having something, it's like something I always knew, like I always understood that I perceived my body differently at certain times, and that's kind of normal. But for me, it's like, okay, the less emphasis I put on losing weight and, you know, trying to fit a body that is never going to be attainable for me, I will be happier. And so it's not always about like thinking about it in terms of bodies, it's thinking about it in terms of like your happiness and how you can perceive yourself to be as happy as possible. And for me, something I'm also really passionate about in the space of like body positivity is really respecting where it came from, first of all, which is fat Black disabled women, and then also looking to something like fat liberation, which is something that is coming into the cultural lexicon a lot more, and talking about how like realistically, one, fat people are systemically oppressed, and it is definitely something that needs to be addressed in society, and two, how linked white supremacy is with fat phobia and the way we view bodies. You know what I mean? And like we've talked about it, we've had an episode, I think probably about a year ago now on the podcast about, you know, thin privilege and pretty privilege, where we spoke about, you know, the racial origins of fat phobia and how we view specific body types and how that really plays with, you know, they kind of play off of each other. That's why I'm like, okay, well, let's move towards how do we get fat people included in the conversation. It's obviously like hard on an individual level, but I think that's, I see people online being like body positivity now, and it's all like smaller fat people or thin people who are, you know, saying I have body dysmorphia and talking about it. And it's like, fine, that's good. But realistically, we now need to be shifting the conversation around to fat liberation, to how do we get fatness accepted in society and having people understand health at every size exists. People who are fat deserve rights regardless of how you feel about their body.
That's a lot to unpack, and I think it's a lot to delve into.
Yeah, it's a very like a tip of the iceberg kind of situation as well.
Yeah. I definitely want to talk about that more and learn more about that. So, who knows? We may be having an episode coming up talking about similar issues. But
yeah,
I think it's great that y'all on your website point to the link between white supremacy and fat phobia, because that's a thing. Because I mean, Black bodies still are demonized, and except like parts of it are okay, right? Like it's okay to have a big butt, or
like it's now kind of sexualized to the point where it like normalizes certain aspects.
But it's always been sexualized and fetishized. I mean, that's we could have a whole conversation.
I think the sexualization is just mainstream now. It's like okay to be into it. That's the difference. Is it's no longer like a fetish specifically. It's about like, oh, you can have the thin waist and the big booty, and that's okay, but you have to have light skin.
Right, exactly. And honestly, I mean, it's a whole other tangent, but I could definitely have a conversation about guys who wanted to date me because they'd never been with a Black chick before. And I'm like, I'm not here to be your first. I'm not here to be an adventure for you. I mean, it's one thing if you're interested in me as a person and I just happen to be the first Black woman that you've dated, but I'm not something to be had or conquered. So that's not going to happen.
Right on.
So so that's a whole story in and of itself.
Sounds like it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, bodies and dating and relationships overlap in very different ways depending on whether or not you're in a bigger body or if you're in a smaller body. Like even being taller is something that I get. Like I feel people like have preferences on that. And I think what is really hard for men to understand is like having a preference doesn't mean that you actively make someone feel like shit about that preference when you are rejecting them for that preference. You know what I mean? Like men will just be like, I'm not into fat girls. I'm like acting as if it's like the worst thing in like, the world for me to be fat. And then I'm like, okay, you didn't even have to say you're not in, just like, I'm not interested. Like, it's fine. You know what I mean? Like, it's a problem.
It kind of goes back to our purpose being here for whatever they desire at a particular moment.
Yes, being like objectified continuously. Yeah.
I'm curious about, you talk about a lot of feminist issues on your podcast, and this is kind of changing the subject a little bit. In the States that we just had the overturn of Roe versus Wade, and I know you talked about it on your podcast, but curious, how does it affect you in Australia, having it being overturned in the United States?
Yes. So, I mean, that's a really good question. I think how it affects us at this point in time is definitely more socially, because we do have very good laws in Australia regarding like the legality of it. It is still criminalized in one state here in Australia. So it's legal. You can get an abortion, but under certain circumstances, it can be criminalized. And I understand it was only just decriminalized in my home state at the start of August, kind of when everything, the start of July, when everything was happening as well. So it did raise questions of like accessibility. And I think a lot of the discourse, at least in my part of the internet online, especially on TikTok, was about, how the overturning of Roe versus Wade was going to impact Black and brown and Indigenous people way more. And that's something that I've always been aware of, because I've been doing gender studies since, if we take it back to high school, since 2013, 2014. And then doing it throughout uni, like I know of scholars like Jane Elliott who's talked about, the birth death and the fear that white people will be eradicated and we will become the minority as white people. And that fear that is very deeply ingrained in, why they decided to overturn Roe versus Wade. So I think it was definitely more of like that social conversation around it, because yes, I believe to an extent our laws are safe here. I also don't want to say that because we've seen a complete reversal of so many things in America since the Trump era. Like, it's not happening in a vacuum. It happens in America, and it's a trickle down effect everywhere, because there's, conservative groups all over the world who look to that and especially look to America as the model of how do we reverse time metaphorically. And
Yeah.
so there's definitely conservative groups here. Like our prime minister, we just had an election. Our prime minister before the one that just got elected was very anti-abortion, very conservative. And it's been that party for a majority of years throughout my life, at least. There is definitely a large population in Australia that don't believe that we should have access to abortion, or at least safe access to abortion. And then again, like, it brings up those issues of accessibility. So yes, abortion is legal. It might be still expensive in some areas. We also have a lot of Indigenous people in Australia living in rural areas. So rural populations not having access to abortion. And also the issue of like, okay, if the majority of women getting abortions already have children, how do we organize daycare for those kids that they already have? Like, there's accessibility holes everywhere throughout abortion. And I think that was like the main point that it raised. But yeah, I think the most concerning is the idea that there will be people inspired by what has happened and how that will affect us. And then I think on a cultural level, people just have empathy. You know what I mean? Like we have empathy for understanding that it's an injustice, and that it's an injustice that has a trickle-down effect, because they're trying to take away gay rights and LGBT rights and interracial marriage. Like it's not stopping just with abortion. And I think anyone who's smart enough to understand that understands that everything in society is fickle.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that answered your question.
It did. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about it in the framework of Australia. And what comes to mind for me is the issues are very, very similar.
Yeah.
So it makes me think that, you know, we're all a lot more connected than people want us to think. You know, the issues are very similar pretty much everywhere. There are always going to be people who are lower down on the food chain and are going to have issues gaining access to the things that they need. And people that are always going to be sadly marginalized. That's not specific to America. That's society in general. We can all relate to each other because we have similar issues regardless of where we live or where we come from.
Yeah. Well, I would even push back a little bit on what you said about it being society in general, because I think that statement implies that this is how we would end up naturally. And I think that this context of like events happens solely because we live in a neoliberal capitalist society.
Got it.
And
yes, very good.
You know what I mean? And again, like that's because Australia in particular, we may be under the British Empire still, but our social and political framework is moving more and more towards an Americanized model. And my mom is American. My mom's name is also Jennifer. It terrifies her because she spent the first 12 years of her life in America. She hated it. And so there has been a push towards privatizing our socialized medicine and the privatization of a lot of sectors, you know, housing, aged care, disability care. It's a terrifying thought to someone like my mom who understands what the consequences of that are. But there is a lot of people in this country who are going to take for granted, you know, things like Medicare. And it's hard because you get that argument of like, well, a conservative politician put Medicare in place, and it's like, okay, well, that's good, leave it there, but how can we improve it? You know, like it's never covered dental. Why does something not like for medical, like, you know, Medicare, why does it not cover dental? Like there's always been holes in it.
Yeah.
But the privatization of it has been something that scared my mom the most. And I've noticed it, like you have to pay to go to doctors every time. And, you know, at the end of the day, it is still way better than America. But I've always said in conversation, like the base point is not America. We should be trying to become way, way, way better than America. And the problem is there's people who want us to regress and go back to like and idolize the American empire, because they're caught up in this idea of the American dream. And I think that the thing about Australia is that the people who are in power are caught up in the American dream. And I think a lot more people in America which is money, of course, are being disillusioned towards that American dream and understanding that it doesn't exist. That we live in a meritocracy, and that privilege will get you everywhere. Privilege will get you the wealth that you want. It doesn't matter. You just have to exist as a white straight guy, and you'll have merit in this society. That's not how it works for everyone. And I think that's why we're able to come here and have a conversation and relate to each other, because we have those intersectionalities of like, I'm a fat woman, I'm a queer woman, I'm a disabled woman, I'm relatable in that sense to you guys. And that, I think, interests you because, these conversations aren't had in a vacuum, like I said before.
What I think is really interesting is that you and your partner have your podcast. Raquel and I have ours. You're in your early 20s. We're in our early 50s. And there's some real parallel things, but then there's also a huge difference, because the difference that I see, and I told Raquel earlier, I really wanted to talk about this. The difference that I see is number one, you guys are so open sexually, and we look like big old prudes compared to you. But number two, you're so comfortable saying, I'm a fat person, I'm a disabled person. I don't have that comfortability. That to me is a swear word. I can't describe myself that way, even though you and I probably weigh the same amount. I'm choosing not to. Maybe from this conversation I'll learn to, but I haven't been able to be comfortable saying I'm fat.
Yeah. Well, I think that was such an early, that specific I'm fat discourse was so pivotal to my early internet experience, because that was what the fat women on the internet were talking about. How do I identify as fat? Or say that discourse of fat is not a bad word was really coming up on the internet when I was 13, 14, 15. And I was definitely bigger then as well. In high school, I was not just the way I was carrying my weight. It was still very much baby fat. And I was I really noticed a change in my body when I hit my early 20s, and my body was maturing in the way it naturally does. So I had a lot of different body issues back then that I do now. And so it was really pivotal for me to have that alternative messaging, because there's definitely was times, again, my grandma in particular, my parents were really, really good about never making me feel any type of way about my body. My mom was really emotionally abused by her mom, and that was the biggest thing, was she was always made to feel ugly and stupid, and her body was never her own. My mom has always had issues in that sense, so she never wanted to put that onto me, and which I'm thankful for. Obviously, she could have ended up just like her mum, but she didn't, just the way that I could have ended up just like my mum, but I didn't.
She broke that cycle for you.
Yes. And I think to kind of, not to take it there, but I have to relate in some way. My mum is your age. She's 50 now, I think. And my mum struggles with similar issues in terms of articulating herself, because for my mum, we've had a lot of conversations about how if she had been, I guess, exposed to the gender discourse that exists now when she was younger, that she would have totally identified as non-binary, and that she totally would have fucked with her gender way more than what was socially acceptable. And I think that's really where it comes from, is the power of the internet. Young people, so millennials and Gen Zs, because I'm the last millennial, some call you zillennial, whatever you want to say about it. I'm the last kind of year for that. For me, I grew up on the internet, and I grew up in a arguably uncensored internet. And so having those conversations online really helped me become okay with I've had a lot more issues recently with things like disabled, because my body has not always been disabled. I think there's a lot of preconceived notions about what a disability is and what a disability looks like. And so when I come out here and I say I'm a non-able-bodied person and I experience chronic pain and X, Y, and Z, there's going to be people who invalidate me because they either can't see my disability, they can't feel my disability, or it's not something that fits in their box of how disabled person exists. It came from an injury and it's an ongoing issue, and it's but the only criteria for a disability is really something that's kind of chronic and impacts your day-to-day life 9 times out of 10, really. And so for me, coming to terms with that has been something that I had to struggle with, or maybe not struggle with, but I had contention, because it was I didn't want to see myself that way, because I also had not misconceptions, but I also had, biases towards people who have disabilities. And so I think when you struggle to articulate yourself and go, oh, I'm a fat person, I'm a queer person, and you say it's because you think those are bad words, it's just a fucking word. That word does not hold any weight.
Right.
That word is a descriptor. It is not bad to be fat. It's not bad to be disabled. It's not bad to be queer. You being visible is what's more important. And yes, there is definitely going to be times where identifying in certain ways, either that's queer, fat, disabled, whatever it is, it will be more dangerous, and you have to pick and choose when you show those aspects of your identity. I think it's important. Just like it's important to talk about how we have experience with drug abuse and family members who have been addicted to drugs. The more visible you are, the better it is, because someone else will hear you or see you and go, I identify, I relate. And I never had someone like me to represent me when I was a teenager. So I want to be that for other people.
So you talk about being visible and identifying a certain way. And one thing that you and Ash talk about and identify as on your podcast is being a feminist. There was a period of time, and I think it's still going on, a period of time where that was a dirty word and nobody wanted to identify as a feminist. I mean, Jennifer and I have always identified as feminists. I mean, I identified as a feminist as a child. So I've never had an issue with that term. So, but I know in society at large, a lot of younger women were saying, oh, I'm not a feminist, but. So can you talk a little bit in that you and Ash in your 20s are like, hell yeah, we're feminists, what of it?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I will preface as well before I answer your question that like I understand that it also comes with a lot of privilege to be able to self-identify and be visible. I do understand that comes with a lot of privilege, and that's part of why I do what I do and why I try and do what I do in a like sensitive way. You know what I mean? Like in an understanding way. To answer your question, I have always been I'm a feminist kind of person, and I think that especially when I was in high school, I think that added to my like, I've always been told I'm intimidating. I've always been told I like have big dick energy. I've always been strong in my morality, and like I have understandings of the way the world works. My understanding is very unique because of my experience and my childhood. So I was always able to call people out, and I've always been a question authority kind of person, because that kind of happens when your parents use drugs. You've got a very specific way of thinking about things, because I've had very traumatic instances with the police, and I've been in very traumatic experiences where things should have happened the way society thinks they should have happened, for lack of a better term, and that doesn't happen that way. So the more you are exposed to that, you become disillusioned to authority. So I'm very much a kind of person personally. I just think there's problems within society, and it comes from upper down to the lower. When those conversations would show up when I was a teenager, in particular in high school, because I was doing women's studies, and when you're doing women's studies in high school, people know you're doing that, so they know you're a feminist, or they know that you might identify that way. And there was definitely those girls in my classes who would be like, I'm not a feminist. Like the way it was then was also because I don't want to say it, but racial slur, not racial slur, the white supremacist group that shall not be named. Yes. No, that's that's why like we can say it for, I think saying it is good because it shows where we've come from, but I think that was being weaponized by the early alt-right and those men's
100%,
rights activists
100%.
to demonize us and to compare us to literal white supremacists, even though we're like, hang on, that's literally what we're against. And I think there was also a really, really, really big lack of understanding around like what feminism is. And I think there still is. Like I have a mini series on the podcast, because sometimes we have to do solo episodes when things don't match up, where I'm talking about like the history of feminism, and I've talked about the waves of feminism, and I've talked about trans feminism and queer feminism. And what people don't understand is that feminism is an umbrella term, and you have lots of different waves, you have lots of different ideologies and, like, for lack of a better term, frameworks within feminism. So you have You have radical feminism, you have liberal feminism, you have trans feminism, you have transnational feminism, you have globalized feminism. So like there's many, many, many different disciplines within what you would see as feminism. And I think for a lot of people at the time, is when I was in high school, so 10 years ago, there was a lot of discourse about like online feminism, and it's been critiqued now and it's been debunked now, because like back then, there's people who were going, hang on, I don't identify with this. It's consistently changing, and I think that's realistically the good thing about it, is because there's more people understanding now what feminism is, and that it's not really shaped by any one thing. You know what I mean? Like it's not one size fits all. And that's why I think intersectionality and intersectional feminism has been what really sparked that, because you had more and more people who had intersectionalities going, hey, that's white feminism, or that's ableist feminism, or that's sex worker exclusionary feminism, or that's, transphobic feminism, and going, hey, like those negative ideologies are seeping into what we're trying to do here. And again, if people understood that like not all feminists have the same agenda, it would be a lot easier to kind of get your point across. Because you meet a feminist, if you're an educated feminist, or if you have any real understanding of what it is, you're going to kind of approach it with apprehension, because one, people lie, and two, you need to figure out what kind of feminist they are, because I don't want to associate with people who don't support sex work or trans people. And that's a really, 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 really big problem in feminism today. And I never, and this is what I say, I never want to like openly talk about the issues within feminism, because I don't want the boys to find out.
Exactly.
I don't want, I want, like keep it in house, people. Like, we can fight amongst ourselves, but like we can't give the alt-right fucking ammunition to take us down.
Good point.
You got to be careful. I feel like I could talk about that for a long time.
We're probably almost out of our hour, but I still want to talk about this difference in like the openness around sexuality. Like, I think your first episode was how to go down. About, and that just makes me turn red just saying it out loud, right? Raquel and I have more of like, I don't know, how would you describe it, Raquel?
I think we just aren't as comfortable with some conversations out loud. Behind closed doors, we're okay with, it's a little easier to have this conversation. I want to put this out there, because this is not an age thing, because I was this in my 20s.
Me too.
I've always had a little bit of, prudeness, even in my 20s.
It can be approached on a macro and a micro level, so on an individual and a larger scale level. And I think in America in particular, there's a lot of influence from religion, and that's not something I experience as much here. It affects it, but like, it's not as big of a problem. And so I think that a lot of it comes from purity culture, and purity culture is what really kind of dictates how we perceive, it's the same thing with like you thinking that fat is a bad word. Like you think, my mum always talked about how when she was a kid and she was raised religious, because she was raised in America for a while, and her mum was religious and stuff like that. She was like, I was fucking terrified to go to the bathroom because I thought Jesus was watching me. Like, things like that. Like she was like, I was traumatized by this rhetoric of like this omnipotent being watching me when I go to the toilet, when I, and that stays with you no matter how, like,
it does.
You can be like, I'm over it, but unless you do the work, it's staying with you. And so it's affected by purity culture on a larger level that obviously affects the individual level. But I also think like there's definitely some people who don't like talking about sex, and that's fine. For me, it's my bread and fucking butter. I love it. Like I love talking about sex in any way, shape, or form, whether it's about me, someone else, society. Like I don't care. I love talking about it, because sex is, one, how we are alive, but two, it is how we experience the utmost of pleasure. It is how we get to connect with another human being or multiple human beings. It's how you get to connect with yourself. It's not just about sex with another person. Like every aspect of sex, and this is a really big part of the reason why I want to do sexology and talk about it on a public platform, is because there is people who don't view sex the way that I view sex, and that's okay. Like if you've come to the conclusion that you don't like sex for whatever reason.
No. I like sex.
Not you specifically, just like in general, like if someone, I'm sorry, I wasn't very clear. If someone comes to the conclusion that they're not into like talking about sex, like that's fine. That I'm not going to push that on you. But for me, like I grew up, again, it's about being on the internet when like, first of all, it was very largely uncensored. My parents also never really censored like what I could watch as well. So I was watching like shit like Dexter when I was like 9. Like I've also been very aware of the fact that I was bisexual when I was a child, like, you know, all of these things. And with that, like question authority kind of mentality, I was like questioning myself. Like, and then when I tried to articulate, you know, oh, I'm bi, or I'm like same-sex attracted to family members, and I had pushback, or I had, you know, weird reactions, or even to friends, you know, I would be like, why can I talk about this? And something I learned recently about myself through understanding that I'm neurodivergent and have autism is that sex is my special interest. That my special interest is like, I literally made a TikTok about it the other day and I got suppressed because I had some sex toys in it. But, you know, my special interest and what makes my autistic brain buzz is talking about sex. So it's not just like I'm sex positive and I'm open about it. I know that I'm like on the end of extreme where like I can talk about this.
I just think that's incredible though. I love it because I want my girls to know sex is pleasure and not be like for me, my biggest thing growing up or getting divorced or after is always like, how many boyfriends have you had? What's your number? And your number's not a positive thing. Like it should be, my number.
Yeah.
But like,
I get it though. Like my mom, and again, like my mom has always had issues based on her upbringing, but my mom and I never talked about sex. We never had those conversations. My dad, I mean, we did, because my mom was very open if I had questions. But my mom never had boyfriends when I was young. And my dad definitely was my dad was a fucking slut when I was a kid. So great. He had girlfriends, he was fucking, I was hearing it, you know, like that kind of stuff. So like my dad was really, really open about it. And he always would talk to me about stuff like that. So I always had like sex positivity in some capacity. My mom just didn't have the ability to articulate it. She'd never had good experiences growing up or, you know, in her relationships. And my mom and I have conversations about it now. She's not interested in being in a relationship. She's never really been interested in being in a relationship. So we talk about different relationship models and how that works for her, and that's okay. And she doesn't need to justify it to anyone else. You know what I mean? And, but the thing about, it's interesting because my mom, I remember at one point, like, telling my mom that I eat ass, and she was like, what? Like she was not contemplating, like she wasn't like shocked because she was like, oh, I'm thinking about my daughter doing something sexual. She was like, I didn't know that was a thing. And I was like, yeah, it's a thing. You know what I mean? Like
first time I heard about it, it was at work, and younger people that were working were talking about tossing each other salad. And I was like, what are you talking about? And the girl came over and I was like, oh,
yeah,
what? I had no idea.
And so, I would not talk about specifics about anything that I do sexually with my mother. I just don't want to have that conversation with my mother. I just don't want it. In fact, right now, just even thinking about it, my brain just wants to shut down.
I know you're turning a little green.
A little bit.
That's valid though. Like I think like my relationship with my mom is it's not one that's like the normal kind of relationship. You know, like I was my mom's mom for a lot of our life. So having conversations about vulnerability is a lot harder than me having a conversation with her about sex. It's about how we connect. And my mom and I are the kind of, like, we can have those open intellectual conversations and have it compartmentalized that we have a mother-daughter relationship because we have a unique mother-daughter relationship. So it's interesting.
You're interesting. This has been, I could talk to you for like 12 hours.
Yeah. I'm glad.
We really want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? Maybe just something you just want to just throw on out there.
I mean, we've talked about a lot, and I think that's great. I think we've covered most things. Like, more than happy to have a part 2 if you ever want to have me back on. Like, more than happy to do that too. I'm happy with how we've covered everything. I really hope that it translates well, and that you're not going to listen back and go, oh, that was a weird thing to say, you know.
No, this is good. Indi, thank you so much for being on the show and being so candid. This was a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. And, I'm always here to be candid.
My dad always says this thing that it embarrasses me, but I think I feel it when I look at you. He says, I want to be like you when I grow up. I feel that like I feel like you're right on.
Thank you. I appreciate, it means a lot. I'm not sitting here going, oh, thanks. Real ego boost. I don't take that lightly. I take that to heart. And I think, again, I struggle a lot with imposter syndrome, and I know this is like a little tangent on the end, but like that's something that I think a lot of people struggle with. And I again, like, it's something I'm really candid about, because not a lot of people feel okay when they struggle with imposter syndrome. And so, you say that to me and I'm like, oh no, like I want to be modest, but at the end of the day, like I know that I've come a long way, and that I've had a life and I've lived a lot in these past 25 years, and to be able to have these conversations, it's really, really, really great. I like connecting with people, and we would have never met had this not been
Exactly
the cosmic situation.
Exactly. Thank you, Indi.
No worries.
Thank you.
Okay, she is amazing. I mean, dude, what you just said about, oh, I want to be you when I grow up, heck yeah.
Oh, I always laugh at my dad when he says that. I think it's goofy. This is the first time I've ever like really felt it about a young person. There is a youthfulness, but also such a maturity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there was an episode of her podcast where she talks about being an old soul.
No.
I definitely feel that she's lived so much and experienced so much and grown and done the work in her 25 years. I mean, there are people our age who haven't matured as much as she has, and who haven't done as much general reflection as well as self-reflection that Indi has. And how lucky are we that we got to have the conversation with her and talk to her firsthand.
Loved every minute of it.
God, if she's this amazing at 25, can you imagine?
Look out, world.
How fantastic.
Look out, world.
Yeah, y'all buckle up, man, because she's coming and she's gonna rock some shit out, man. This is awesome. I can't wait to see what she does in the world. Thank you, Jennifer.
Bye, Raquel.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast, or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.